Hey everyone, welcome to the Mirror Media Podcast. Today I am joined by Gnostic Informant Neal Sandlek. He's frankly one of the coolest podcasters, video casters, whatever you want to call it, out there. And it's cool because for the kind of work I'm doing is what he's doing. He's been doing it for longer, and he's also doing it cross-cultural, like cross Judeo-Christian, pagan past, Middle Eastern, meaning like Sumerian and
Mm,
Babylonian cultures, and integrating it not just with new interesting ideas, but scholarship that I think is important for most people to recognize and get in. And the discussions you have, frankly, Neil, are pretty fantastic. Some of them are totally left field, which as they should be, but some of them are like right in the main like thrust of scholarly development and growth. And I do think that's such a huge import to have both those viewpoints because sometimes the extreme side eventually kind of like tapers the mainstream side. So, Neil, welcome to
yeah,
the podcast. Thank you, man, for
thank
for
you.
taking the time.
Yeah, and this is an interesting topic for right now because on the internet, there's so much out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of like uh self self-taught experts that are just teaching completely the opposite of what you get in the academic circles. But because there's so much distrust of academia and the media, and there's so much of that going on, most people flock to those type of people.
Right.
So I think when you mentioned me and Derek are also, we haven't gone through. I don't have a PhD.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert. I'm not an academic. But as much as I'm trying to explore on my own and trying to be, I'm a little bit autodidactic in some senses. I'm learning Greek and I'm learning Hebrew, and I'm, calling a lot of scholars on the phone, asking questions. I'm sort of getting a informal education in that sense.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people are coming to me and Derek because we talk like normal people. We dress
Right.
like normal people. We're not like acting like academics. We're not trying to be like, well, I'm not going to stray too far from the consensus here. No, me and Derek are not scared to do that. So,
Right.
so something about that people like, but I'm trying to keep it as in is in the bounds of academic uh rigor is possible. Like I'm trying to weigh what I'm doing against the academics, against the experts. That's why I bring them on my channel. That's why I ask them questions, why I do my interviews with them. I'm not just trying to be one of these like self-taught experts.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you how the pyramids were built, even though I haven't touched a single academic book on the subject. Like I'm not trying to do that, but I am trying to be a sort of a middleman and sort of being like, look, I'm in the same boat as y'all. I'm interested in these things. An amateur at this stuff, but I also want to let's let's bring these things together. Why they don't need to be separate. We don't have to have this distrust for academia. They're just people like us.
Yeah.
So that's why you see me kind of playing both sides, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, there's so many threads you just touched upon here because I do want to talk about why there's distrust of academia, and then the importance of having the middlemen that kind of like in some sense like you're Moses that's bringing down the Ten Commandments from the gods and such. You're brokering these relationships because at some level, like academics do, I do think they become so insulated in their world
Yeah.
that they're not fully cognizant of what's going on around them in that same area. And I do think part of the thing that's important is in what you do is in that engagement. I think what really happens is the academics, especially you and Derek, you confront them also on their positions and bring up other scholars that might disagree with them and kind of
Right.
have them rebut buttress their own position and rebut the other side. So that offers a
Yeah.
little bit of more like flavor because the academic is going to be nuanced. They're not going to be like,
Yes.
well, they're not going to spray it like with the broad brush. They're going to get nuanced into it. And,
Yeah.
and
And I
right,
noticed this happens all the time where some scholar in some particular field who has sort of a narrow vision. I'm not saying that
yeah,
in a bad way, but that's
yeah,
because they're studying one subject and they're brilliant experts in that one subject, like
right,
one of the like world class in some cases. But then they'll be like, I'll get pushback by those people on certain things. Like, hey man, what you just pushed right there in your channel, that is neck. Nah, man. What are you
Yeah.
talking about? And then I'll go. What do you mean? I didn't make that up. I got that from this professor over at
Yeah.
Oxford. This is
Yeah.
what he wrote in this peer reviewed book. And this person also says the same thing in this peer reviewed book. And this person
Right.
also says the same thing. And then all of a sudden they're going, yeah, okay. Well, I just don't think that's the case. And it's like, what do you want? Like, just because you didn't hear it, you're not aware of it. Then,
Right.
and I'm saying it's coming from my mouth, so it must
Right.
not be true. So, but I've seen this type of thing happen all the time. But what I've learned is that the so-called consensus
Yeah.
is not always what it seems. A
Mhm.
lot of times, you get a consensus on certain things. A big example of this is biblical scholarship, New Testament scholarship, which is populated by a lot of people who are affiliated with churches, who are Christians, who are Jewish people, who are Muslim people, whatever.
Right.
And they're sort of a force in that sector of academia, that there are certain norms that are accepted more than others.
Right.
But then you have like certain archaeologists in certain particular fields, like archaeologists that live in Israel, that can go to the sites anytime they want. They're there, they live there. They can just go to the sites. They have a car that can just
Mhm.
walk up to the sites, and they can do research. And these are the people that I'm talking to and going, well, what's going on over there? What do you see? Is there any evidence of this before in this period? What
Yeah.
about evidence of this in this area? And I'm learning from these people. What's funny is these people who live in Israel, who are professors at major universities, Tel Aviv University, and they're on the ground and they're at these sites. They live there. They know everything by heart.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they're not going along with the consensus, who are a bunch of people in America who've only been to Israel once in their lifetime, or maybe a few times, and they don't live at these sites like these guys do. They don't
Right.
even study these subjects. But so what I notice is sometimes the consensus can be unbalanced.
Right.
Sometimes the real bona fide narrowed experts in the one field will say something that's not the consensus of all these other people who are in other fields, but they're all together as the consensus. So sometimes the consensus can be unbalanced. I've
And
noticed that.
and that's interesting because like I do think a lot of times when you talk about people with consensus, they tend to be literary individuals, right? Focus on the text, really
Mm.
about like the textual sources, the textual history, connections. Whereas the archaeologists sometimes who are on the ground, who go see the sites, have a very different view
Way
of
different.
what does the text represent the ideal, or does it represent the actual, and or even does it represent a microcosm of the actual, right? Like, maybe the text was written in 625, but this site is for 200 years, so now you're seeing this spread of 200 years of like development versus just that tiny little piece of time. It's such a fascinating, like,
It
how
is.
these layers of knowledge sometimes work together and sometimes kind of butt heads.
Yeah, and I was actually I was interested to talk to you because I'm wondering, and I've been wanting to get more into the whole Eastern slash Vedic slash
Yeah,
um Indian philosophy, Indian spirituality. Um, they call it Hinduism in the West, but
sure.
there's so many. Hinduism is like saying Gnosticism. Like there's so many branches underneath what we call Hinduism that all disagree with each other. They're not so like sort of like an umbrella term. But I'm interested because I'm wondering about when it comes to the Rig Veda, for
Hmm.
example. I see a similar system or a similar um play out of what I see in the West with scholars when it comes to the Torah, where you
Okay.
have a conservative group of scholars who want to keep the Torah as old as possible. Regardless of the evidence, they want to keep pushing it back against the evidence and keep
Hmm.
going, well, maybe there was some sort of priestly class that just didn't write anything down, and they
Sure.
kept it orally tradition for all these years, and then it gets written down in the Hellenistic period, and like okay, there's that's like the far extreme in the conservative. And there's people in between who
Hmm.
actually look at the evidence and go, well, probably around 500 BC, more like it. And then there's all the way the minimalist side who are like, no, 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 no. There's no evidence of the Torah until 300 BCE. And in fact, they don't even enforce the Torah until the second century BCE. So you have this wide spectrum of scholarship on when the Torah is written and
Right.
when it's known to the populations and when it's enforced. Those are three different
Mhm.
questions. I'm wondering if in the Rig Veda, I look up the Rig Veda, just a quick Wikipedia search just to see when it's dated to. It'll say between 1500 and 500 BC. Well, that sounds just like the Torah problem.
So yeah, there's interesting natures here because the outer bound of 1500 is because I mean, there's two threads. Max Mueller back in 1800, he just randomly set a date of 1500, and luckily, what happened is over time, um, evidence coalesced around it at some level, right? But by this, what I mean is, so you have the discovery of other Indo-European languages, right? Like their connection between Greek, Roman, I mean Latin, Sanskrit, Tocharian, Armenian, and Avestan. All these languages are connected. So when those languages became saw the bridge between these connections, now you're like, okay, they have to have a source. Where is that source? Then you go back to Pi, Urmat. So the 1500 date is connected to the time period of when they thought the Indo-Aryans came into the the
Yeah,
Gangetic plain in some sense, because the Rig
there's ev-
Veda
there's evidence
knows.
for that too, if I'm not mistaken. There's
Yeah, there
archaeological.
is, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of there's no archaeological evidence. No,
Oh,
there's
really?
no archaeological evidence.
Of the
There's
Aryans?
of the Aryans coming in. No,
Oh, okay. Okay.
there's a lot. There's a lot of what they would call, linguistic evidence is what they'll say, and then there's now the idea is to connect genetics to it, and there's
Oh, yeah.
some
Yeah.
there's some things you can say about it positively and some things you can't. So when you look at the Vedic system, the Vedic, so they basically said around 1500. Usually the dating is somewhere between 1800 and 1200, but they use
Yeah.
1500 as the median mark,
As the
right?
medium. Yeah.
Yeah. So when they're saying is this is the time period the Indo-Aryans came into the Indian subcontinent, because the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of all the Indo-European languages, or oldest extent of the Indo-European languages, only knows of a region of basically Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, and
Arya,
northern India. Yeah,
which used to be called Arya.
yeah, Aryavarta is the term
Yeah.
that we use in
Aryavarta. Yeah.
Sanskrit. Yeah, so that region is they don't know anything else. They don't know of a migration coming from somewhere else.
Right.
So the what happens is as super orthodox Hindus will take the position, and in some way, it's a linguistic position that the Vedas are timeless, meaning basically they don't exist. They don't come into being in the world. They're not man-made. They're like they're seen by the sages, and then they're brought into the world by the drishta or the vision. So they gain the vision, and then
Through the
they
Soma sacrifice, I'm guessing, right?
well, no, Soma is a sacrifice that comes later. So,
Oh, okay.
so the liturgy comes after the mantras come, right? So the mantras, so the Vedas are broken down into four portions: the mantra samhita, and then it's called Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads. So these are the four sections, and you can say basically they're temporally connected, right? The oldest section is going to be your mantra section, which is what they would call Rig Vedic 1500 BCE. Let's use that. So, but the difference about the Vedic system and the preservation is the obsession with orality, like the exact intonation, the exact way it's pronounced. So, like every Indologist, by the way, in any school across all the world is going to say this text is preserved almost immaculately. And the person, like the foremost Vedic scholar in the West is Michael Witzel at Harvard, and he'll give the statement that it's almost like listening to a tape recorder.
Yeah.
Because the way it's preserved, if you go to India and you see how these guys preserve it, like so they grab the head, they move the heads to get the head aligned with the exact verbing, the exact month. Like for example, like if I were to do the Purusha Suktam in my tradition is Sahasra Shirasha Purusha Sahasraksha
Oh, so you know the
Sahasrapa.
meter too.
Yeah. So the
Okay.
meter, all that. So all that's part of it, right? Like this, the chandas, the intonation, where it's so all that's part. So
Yeah.
when you get that, it's much more, it's much easier to memorize, and they have math attached to it.
Yeah. Can I jump in for that for
Yeah.
1 second, if you
Sorry.
don't mind? Put a
Yeah.
put a
Yeah.
little pin on that because this is interesting. Can I share my screen right now?
Yeah. You should be able to share
Okay.
your screen.
So the Rig Veda has a meter. I just found this out recently. Can you see what I'm sharing?
Yeah.
How do you pronounce this? Gayatri?
Gayatri. Yeah.
Gayatri meter.
Yeah.
And it has spondies and dactyls. This is a dactyl. This is a spondee. That's what they call it in Greek.
Right.
And it goes dum da dum dum da da dum dum da 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 dum da da dum dum da dum da dum. I probably messed it up, but the point I'm making is, if you actually look and so that's a very simple meter of the Rig Veda, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just there's two different types of sounds, dum and da. It's just like dum da da dum da da dum da da. And then if this is what fascinates me. The reason why I'm bringing this up, I'm going to share my screen one more time.
Sure.
Is Homer's Iliad?
Yeah.
Also has these same dactyls and spondies right here,
Yeah.
and it's the meter isn't identical, but it's very similar. So I can even sing you the first line of Homer. It's me nina we de thea pe le we adeo akele wos. Right here, me nina we de. And see, that's a digamma. It's an old, ancient Indo-European letter that the Greeks dropped off.
Right.
We de thea pe le we adeo akileos. And I basically just said the wrath sing goddess of Peleus' son Achilles.
Yeah.
That meter, you can tell. And by the way, someone who's written on this, M.L. West wrote on this right here. I'll just show you this book real quick. M.L. West, Indo-European myth and
poetry. Yeah.
Poetry. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he talks about the prose, and they're not identical, but they're so similar that you have to go, this Rig Veda and this Homer is going back to something way more ancient. More, something Bronze Age, something way before that.
Yeah, like the Gayatri would go like the tat savitur vere enyam but go deva siddhimahi dhyo yodha prachodayat, right? So, but then the way they do the memorization is they assign letters to each one, and then so so when you go, there's 5 different paths of memorization. You have to learn this. There's pada, which is word by word by word. There's krama, which is 2 words. It's 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, and then you mix it up, something like that. And then there's like where the bell formation is the last one. It's called Ganta, which is basically the idea is, I'll show you a video. It might be very interesting if I can do this now, because this will be helpful to understanding how the memorization occurs.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a sentence. When you see in pada, 1, 2, 3.
So basically,
4.
I don't want to go through the
5.
whole thing, but this
is pada.
I'll just give you
the same mantra can be recited in krama. Krama is you have to take 2 words at a time, like 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5.
So he'll give you, and we'll go through the first 2 examples, and then
can be recited in jata.
You'll see what the breakup of words occur.
2 words combination of 6. For example, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2. 2, 3, 3, 2, 2, 3. 3, 4, 4, 3, 3, 4. 4, 5, 5, 4, 4, 5. This is a very known mantra.
Yeah, so he's doing
mantra
this
is known to you.
So the
Gayatri is a mantra will be like this. Tat saviturvarenyam bhargo devasya dhimahi dhiyo yo nah prachodayat. This is the sentence.
Wow.
Now the pada. Tat savituhu varenyam bhargaha devasya dhimahi dhiyaha yaha naha prachodayat. This is called pada. Now we have to combine two words. It is called krama.
Krama was interesting.
Tat savituhu saviturvarenyam varenyam bhargaha bhargo devasya dhimahi dhimahi ti dhimahi dhiyo yaha Yo naha nah prachodayate
Now, what is that? Do you know what that means
prachodayaditi
right there?
The
prachodayate.
mantra?
Do you know what? Yeah. Do you know what those words mean right there? Like, do
Yeah.
you know that? What did
Yeah.
he say right there? I'm just curious what the lyrics were.
So tat savitur, that savita, which is that sun, you can say, vare
Oh, yeah,
enium,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, who
Surya.
provides a badgaha, bring the tat savitur vare enium badgo. So this is why it's interesting when he says tat savitur. So we have the sandhis, right, which are called euphonic combinations. So when badga meets devas, it becomes badgo devas. So the word badga as just by itself, when it meets the word devas, because of the ending, the word changes. The ending of the word changes. So it's a tat savitur vare enium badgo
Because he
devasya
has to
dhimam.
follow the meter, right?
Well, it's not the meter that controls it. It's the euphonic combination.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
yeah
It's the rules of the rule. Yeah, exactly.
of the word conjunction, right?
Homer has the same. Homer has the same situation. The words can change. The
Yeah,
vowels can go long or short based on how they fit it in the meter.
yeah, because it's about like the rules in Sanskrit is called sandhi, where when two words meet, it's like the best example in English is the word handbag, right?
Yeah,
It's handbag, but people say handbag. The
yeah,
the D
handbag.
gets dropped because of the B that comes before, and they become kind of like one word. So similarly, like in Sanskrit and most Indo-European languages, they have the euphonic combination, but the difference is Sanskrit actually lays out the rules very clearly, where in Greek it's not laid out that much. You later on, like some people will talk about it, but in Sanskrit it's very, very, very well laid out. Where if A is before these type of letter aspirants like ka, ka, whatever it is, the A will change to become O or something like that, depending on context.
Right. Yeah, the vowel has to change a little
Right.
bit. Yeah, it's interesting. So, what does it say about the sun? It said the sun did what?
So may the sun give you intelligence or wisdom in that sense. May you're asking for that prayer is basically what it's saying.
Oh, that's interesting. Um, because you get that a lot in Homer, where it opens up lines about like the dawn or the sun or sometimes Apollo, where there's
Yes.
some sort of light bringer that shows up in the first scene of the chapter.
Yeah. So I mean, it's basically saying like, may we attain that Lord, Vede Inyam, the Lord Savita, which is used as the sun, but it also is an analog for Brahman, and
Yeah,
and may he guide our thoughts, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
So
very fascinating. You could hear that Indo-European faint, distant relative in the background of both of those.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they had to have a system of preservation of their stories, right? And I think the rhythmic format was very, very important for them.
Absolutely,
Uh,
especially
and,
without
and
writing. Without
yeah,
writing,
and no,
you know.
the question to you is in your studies of with Hebrew and Judaism, do they have similar things like this, or is
Yes,
it okay?
yes. The Torah was sung to people.
Yeah,
There was an oral, not all of it. The Psalms. So this would be Tanakh, not Torah, but the Psalms were obviously songs played with the
right.
harp. That's what the word Psalm in Hebrew it's Mishle. They call it. It's the songs for a harp, basically. The Orphic hymns in Greek perform with the song. Most most of the ancient Greek literature was performed in meter, in some type of meter. There's
Yeah,
Aeolian meter. There's there's different types of meters that you get. Sappho was singing her songs all the way back in the 7th century BC,
right.
and this is how they get preserved. And then people start writing more. They start writing it down, and it just becomes text. But we don't even realize when we're reading songs that
Yeah.
have become narratives. You
It's
know?
funny because, like, I grew up. My dad taught me a lot of this Vedic stuff, and Sanskrit too. So I grew up learning a lot of the things, not reading, but like chanting, right? Like for example, like even in, there's you've heard the Ramayana. There's this section in the Ramayana called the Aditya Hridayam, which is means the heart of the sun, right? So, it starts with, tato yada parishantam samare chityastakam ravanam chargagho drishtva yuddhaya samupastitam deva deva samagamya dushta apyagatoranam upaghamyam aprametramam agastyo gvan rishihi. So, so it's chanted differently, and that's a shloka format. So so that's basically 4 lines, eight syllables in each line. So it's a very easy one, and the Mahabharata has a large portion of it in shloka. Like if you look at it, even you start with the text Dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta yutsava mamakam pandavas chaiva kimakurvata sanjaya. Right, the same. If you break it down, you can see 8 syllables in each line, and that's a shloka. So it's different from the Gayatri, which is 3 by 8, which is leads you to 24 versus 32, and then the numbers play a role in later mystical things. So it's pretty cool that way. Like once you get into it, it's pretty cool. But we took a little bit of a tangent, but it's a
Yeah.
good tangent. I
Yeah.
do want to ask about your background. Like, how did you get into this? Like, who are you? What kind of like drove you here? And I know this is like now we're like media res, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, so I got fascinated in ancient religions when I was actually went to prison when I was in my early 20s, early 20s. For possession of different types of drugs and stuff like that.
I used to be a prosecutor, by the way,
I was running with a bad crowd in my early 20s
in New York.
In New York, and wound up in prison. Started reading a lot of read the Bible cover to cover.
Mhm.
Became a Christian, but
Okay.
also was fascinated by other sources too. I was reading the Mahabharata, which has the Bhagavad Gita within it. I was reading the Dhammapada, with the words of the Buddha.
Yeah.
I was reading Upanishads. I was reading Ramayana. I was fascinated by these Eastern texts because the library that was in there had a whole had a whole section of all these Indian literature, and I was like, I want to see what they got going on.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated about how similar the Buddha was with Jesus.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I was fascinated with. They both have this sort of they have this similar, how do I want to pronounce this, outlook, where like the Buddha will say things like, keep your thoughts and your mind on just Brahman. Like it's almost like a faith thing. Just follow Brahman. Just follow. That's in the last chapter of the Dhammapada. I'll just pull it up real quick so you know what I'm talking about. In the last chapter of the Dhammapada, he says, it's called the Brahman, and he tells his audience. This is like very similar to what you get with Jesus's
Sure.
What is it called? The his
Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount. Yeah. And he basically says, the one I call Brahman, who walks in the footsteps of the Buddha, light your torch from the fire of his sacrifice. It is not matted hair nor birth that makes a Brahmin. See, it doesn't matter where you're born, who you are.
Yeah.
But truth and love for all of life, with one's heart is full. What use is matted hair? What use is deerskin on which to sit for meditation if your mind still sees with lust? The Brahmin has thrown off all chains and trembles not in fear. No selfish bonds can ensnare what the one I call Brahmin has cut through the strap and thong of chain of karma. So they have a very similar attitude, where they're both coming out of, Jesus is coming out of Judaism, the Buddha is coming out of what we would call the Vedic culture, and they're both pushing back against a lot of the norms.
Yes,
and so
no. So on that point, it's
well, yes and no for both of them.
Yeah.
Jesus is pushing back on certain things, but he's also emphasizing lost things that other Pharisees and Sadducees are missing. So the Buddha is doing something similar. The Buddha is not like completely rejecting the Dharma path, but he's also also saying some of these sages are doing things wrong. Here's why.
So this is the interesting part within the Vedic tradition. There's two traditions, and this is why it's important for him when he talks about the Brahmana. He's not talking about Brahman which is, the supreme entity. He's talking about a Brahmana, which is like the Varna or the community of who a Brahmin is, right? So
Right.
within the Vedic tradition, there's two paths. There's the path of Brahmanas, which means basically the textual path, the path you follow the Vedas, particularly the liturgy and all that stuff. And then the other tradition is called Shramana. Shramana is the path of asceticism. So Buddha followed the ascetic path, but that was also considered part of the twofold path within Vedic tradition. There's a
Right.
path of the liturgy, and then there's a path of the going to the forest, being an ascetic. So he chose the latter path, and in that, I think what he did is he delved into other traditions within the Dharmic fold, which is maybe even like Sankhya, Ajivikas. There's a bunch of other like viewpoints, right? At this point, like a lot of these ideas are all in mesh and they're moving around. There's no like fixed necessary school. And he kind of developed
Similar to the West,
yeah.
similar to
Yeah.
the West, where the schools are all breaking apart, blending into each other.
Yeah. So
they call it. They call it Middle Platonism. It's just
Yeah.
like a whole. It's a mix of Stoicism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Platonism,
right.
cynicism, all that stuff.
So on your journey, going back to your journey, so you were in prison, you were studying
Yeah.
these texts, and then like,
And I'm fascinated by the similarities that I'm finding. And I wouldn't call myself a perennialist. Perennialist is like somebody who like
yeah.
really, really carries themselves as somebody who just sees a common denominator in all these religions. I don't know if I would say I'm that, because I see the differences as well, blatant
Yeah.
differences. And I know, these traditions do not sort of go hand in hand. They have differences. There are major differences. They're not, you can't unify these religions. I understand that. However, the common denominators might not be the same, but there's a lot of similar numerators. That makes sense. There's a lot of things on top. A lot of these cults have dying and rising god figures. A lot of these cults have a soul demiurgic creator, similar like we find in the Rig Veda hymn, where there's the one or whatever, however it's pronounced in Sanskrit.
Purusha.
Yeah, and where he out of the chaos of watery chaos creates the cosmos, and then desire springs forth. Well, we see this in the West, in Hesiod, and in the Genesis, and in the Numa Elish in Babylon. And I'm just so what I found. I think what started me off on this path was, one, becoming a Christian, and two, noticing all these common threads throughout the ancient literature. And I think at some point I started to, when I was going to church for many years after prison, which got my life together. I haven't had any major, fallbacks since those early 20 days. I've been pretty good, probably because of religion, and I do credit religion for that. But I studied my way out of Christianity because I was going to a church that had all these dogmas and doctrines about which Bible is the perfect Bible and which doctrine is the perfect doctrine. And I remember I remember challenging these things on my own and discussing with other people from different churches, different traditions,
right?
And then realizing that in my opinion, Christianity wasn't true. At least wasn't the truth. It was one path. I just realized that I'm the type of person that's not meant to be in one particular tradition. I'm what I would call myself. I started calling myself a Gnostic.
Yeah.
And I believe that gnosis was this idea of attaining knowledge about the world, about myself, about the cosmos, and the relationship between the two.
Yeah.
Divine knowledge, right? Reading about philosophy, ancient philosophers, reading about theologians, reading about these ancient scriptures, and trying to apply it to myself and try to be better.
Right.
So I do call myself a Gnostic in that sense. People get confused because when they think of Gnostic, they think of the Sethians, they think of they think of the Nicene Valentinians, and it's like no, I'm not one of those guys. But they were. I like those guys. I want to read those guys, and I want to do videos about those guys too.
Yeah.
But I'm not boxing myself into one of those categories. I'm trying to stay out of those boxes.
So have you do you still consider this is like a loaded question, but it is what it is. Are you a theist still, or are you atheist, or are you kind of like you're kind of open to everything? Or
I'm going to steal a line from Esoterica, Dr. Justin Sledge from the channel Esoterica.
Yeah.
He calls it post-theism.
Okay.
We both came to the conclusion that that question is pointless.
Okay.
Because theism offers a worldview, it offers structure, and it offers comfort to people who lose loved ones. There's a lot of things theism brings to the table that we shouldn't be so quick to detach it from ourselves so quickly, even if we think evolution is true, or if we think certain scientific things go against theism. Well, that's why post-theism makes sense, because the question itself is just pointless. So I'm not an atheist. I don't go around calling myself a theist, but I also don't call myself an agnostic either.
Yeah.
I literally go with the word Gnostic, because I'm someone who just wants to know what we can know. And that's it. And I know this too. I know that there is something that's within us, that we get inspired. Something within our soul or psyche or mind or brain, whatever you want to call it, our psyche, whatever you want to call it, that we can get inspired. The Greeks called it the muse. There was 9 muses, right? Something that inspires us to go out and do things in the world. There's the idea of the daimon, the personal daimon. Socrates had his own personal daimon, or in medieval sources, Christians decided to riff off this daimon thing, and you have a guardian angel,
right?
And sometimes you have a guardian angel and a demon on your shoulders. And I actually follow that. I actually think we do have sort of these thoughts within us that tell us things, that guide us. I call it divine inspiration, or Plato called it mania. Now people hear mania today and they go, mania? What are you, a maniac? No, that's not what he meant by that. It means to be inspired by something outside of you.
Yeah.
So if that's definitely not atheism. So I can't say it's not atheism. Yeah. It's also not I'm also not being agnostic about this. I'm saying I think this is what's going on. So do I call it theism? I don't know.
That's you tell interesting. Me. No, it's interesting because I struggle with that term too, because when we say theism, it comes loaded with preconceived ideas, which I think are largely a product of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in terms of how we conceive of the theos. But within the Hindu tradition, even the Buddhist tradition, in some sense, this the idea of Brahman, and in their tradition, Buddhist is Tathagata Garbha. There's something there that's not necessarily the same, right? It's not. Well, there might be an element of personality and personhood in that context, and it's there for sure. But it's also much more than that. It's like consciousness, like the idea of Brahman as consciousness, as reality, as blissfulness, as an inherent nature of the rising and the arising and dissolution of all things, is like something outside of just human existence, right? Or the human psyche. So in that sense, I call myself a theist in that I do believe in again, the term being is weird, but like the ground of being that is greater than all things, and that we're trying to understand in some sense.
And then there's a whole nother layer that it gets thrown into the mix, which is entheogens, which is a term coined by Dr. Carl Ruck, which is the use of psychoactive substances in ancient cults, Soma, Haoma, Kaikion, Kukeon. There's dozens of fumigation that you find. If you read the Orphic hymns, it tells you which drug to fumigate to honor which god. There's certain rituals they did to get into certain states of mind in order to contact certain gods. That is mind blowing. That I don't think is explored enough. The use of psychoactive substances to access the divine. And I'm somebody myself who's dabbled with DMT and ayahuasca, who have experienced directly what these people were talking about and why they were doing this. It's a real thing. And it all goes back to that inspiration, being inspired, being attuned to something outside of you. It sounds crazy. It sounds crazy to people who've never tried it or have never really got into this little
Yeah,
area,
we
but
have this
it's not crazy.
we have this weird um hatred of drugs in a way that the ancients um ritualized it in a setting that they understood the power of these things truly, right? Like, but they also understood that this is important for human development. And part of that is the rituals like Homa, Soma, Kaikatan is like you don't do it willy-nilly. You don't walk down the street you're drinking Soma or whatever.
Right.
You do it in a context in which you have engagement
Very
with
serious. It's very
yeah,
serious. This isn't like
yeah,
a joke. You're not just getting wasted for fun. This is very
right.
serious. I agree with
And
that.
and the thing is, but the problem today is we don't know what those things are a lot of times. Like we don't, no one knows what Homa is or Soma is. Like there's conjectures if this is ephedra, if it's some sort of
Same
mushroom.
with kukeon. By the way,
Yeah,
all those three words,
yeah,
soma, homa, and kukeon, are
yeah,
all cognate with this Indo-European word guhu, gu,
yeah,
guhu, and it becomes branched out into three different languages. Ku comes from gu, and
yeah.
then gu goes into ho, and then gu also or ho also goes into soma. Anyways, the point I'm making is we lost our recipe on how to make this stuff. We there's a couple of sources that mention the grain of Demeter. So there's like, oh,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
it's ergot, and then some sources talk about certain fungus or whatever, or certain cassia or certain like roots that you pull out of the ground, root
Right.
cutters. Maybe milk is involved somehow. So there's little clues, but we don't know how they made it, what their recipe was. All we know is that it's so old
Yeah.
that all three of these languages convert back to an Indo-European language where the word is used for libations and to pour.
Right.
So at some point back in prehistory, they were involved in the process of producing some sort of psychoactive substance for ritualistic purposes to contact deities. It's
You
mind blowing.
know, it's really interesting
It
too.
might be, and it might be the basis of all religion.
I mean, I wouldn't doubt that at some level, right? Like, when we're back as cavemen, so to speak, or whatever it was, like, like our first true experience of the divine might have been to something with some plant or herb we took, and suddenly it's like blew our minds that there's a world out there that isn't dying and death and constant struggle for survival, maybe. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting prospect, right? But it's interesting. In the Greeks, I always wonder is because Soma in Vedic is connected to the moon, right? Also, and because of the nature of they connected plants and herbs to the moon, and all
So, yeah.
things that are, and so I wonder if something similar
Oh,
happens
and
in.
the ancient Greeks very much were all lunar. Their concept of time was lunar. So
Yeah.
most cultures in the ancient world were lunar, except for the Egyptians, who
No,
were very solar.
the Vedics were solar.
Yeah. Oh, were they?
Yeah.
Okay, so they had a solar calendar.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
They have both. So they have a solar calendar, lunar calendar, and a solar lunar calendar.
Solar, yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Solar
Yeah.
lunar is the most common form of the calendar, where it's there. So how they the reason why it's called solar lunar is because you make a calendar of 12 months
Yeah.
based on the moons. So you have 12 moons. The first day of the month starts on a new moon. The middle of the month is a full moon, so it's always
Yeah.
the 14th day. You find this in Jewish culture. You find this in Greek culture. You find this in ancient Etruscan, Roman culture, all over the place, except for the Egyptians had. Well, the Egyptians actually did have a similar solar lunar, but it was more solar for some reason. I can't remember why. But
Right.
anyways, yeah, they tune it with the sun in order to keep those years going. So the years are solar, but the months are lunar, which is kind of similar to what we're doing right now, except the only difference is we no longer Julius Caesar's reforms, and this is why the Egyptians were different.
Yeah.
Julius Caesar adopts the Egyptian calendar, which they didn't start a new moon on a new month.
Yeah.
It was 31, 31, 30, 31, 31, 30. And so it would just be random whenever the new moon would happen. But the Greeks and the Europeans, they started their months on a new moon. So yeah, their culture was based on the moon in that sense. They were so same with the Jews too, the Babylonians. The Shabbat, the seventh day. The reason why it's the seventh day is because on the 14th day of the month, which was the second seventh day,
Yeah.
you would have a full moon, which was called the Shabbat in Babylonian. But
Interesting.
somehow, at some point, it becomes every 7 days instead of every 14 days.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that. It's pretty fascinating because in the Indian context, you have the solar calendar, which is like Uttarayana, Daksharayana, which is basically the movement of the sun, the northward trajectory, and the southern trajectory, meaning basically like the summer solstice when it's the sun is rising to its zenith, and then when the sun goes down below its zenith, right? Like which we now do is something similar to like summer solstice, winter solstice, right?
Correct.
So those are like solar kind of calendars, but they did actually have lunar too, right? Because you'd see the days by the 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 devolving of the moon and then the rising of the moon.
Yeah,
But
so
the
it's probably
same,
lunar solar then.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
something similar. And then, but we also have astrological in the sense of we track time through the stars,
right.
which is
The
for
great
different,
years, the great
yeah,
years. Yeah,
and then that's done differently by different people. It's. I mean, the human's way of developing like with the same information, coming up with different things.
yeah.
It's pretty damn
This is
cool.
what I was fascinated by when I was reading all these cultures. But you mentioned how the Soma was connected to the moon,
Yeah,
in the same sense that the rituals in Eleusis, for example, would be designated for certain times of the year
yeah,
based on the sun, well, based on where they are in the year, also, but
yeah,
also the moon. So a full moon might probably be the day where they would host the great mysteries.
yeah,
And I think they saw the moon as very much had power over humans, especially with women, because women had their not to get too into details, but obviously women have their cycles,
cycles. Yeah,
and it's that they're seeing, the priests and the medicine men or whatever you want to call them, the shamans, they would see that these women are completely under the power of the moon. That's why a
right.
lot of these cultures have a moon deity that's feminine. Not all of them. There's a lot of male moon gods too. But you notice a trend of the Selena or Luna.
Right.
These are moon goddesses. Where because why not? That makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, in in Vedic, it's Chandra or Soma. He's called Chandra or Soma, and it's a male figure.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
but
that's
he,
interesting too, because Soma, or not Soma, Sebaceous,
yeah,
who's a lunar god, he's got the horns of the moon on his head. He stands on a lunar bull. It's called a
yeah,
lunar bull, and he's the god of intoxication. And get this, I don't know if you know this yet, but um, one of these early Indo-European authors, I'm trying to think of his name right now, um, Jan de Vries.
okay,
He's dead. He's probably died in the 70s. Um, he posited, and this is actually a still accepted theory. It's not like a consensus,
yeah,
but it's still, you can still read about this theory. It's very, very open and possible. He posited that Sabazius is actually Shiva cognated through through an earlier form, because if you actually look at the Indo-European way to say Saba is actually Siva or Saba. And then so he basically posited that because he notices all these lunar things going on with Shiva, and
yeah,
Shiva being connected to Soma and intoxication, that he said there might be a connection between Sabazius and Shiva.
yeah. I mean, there might be. The difficulty with Shiva is so he has obviously he's not the name Shiva doesn't occur in the Veda. The name that occurs in the Veda is Rudra.
Right.
So Rudra means the howler, like roaring, it's very Rud is that which, roars. So Rudra is the howler, and he is technically within the Vedic tradition considered the outsider. He's the one that when you do all your Vedic rites, you have a portion for him to appease him because he is the terrifier, the one that the devas are kind of scared of because he sits in the background, just like kind of like I mean I don't
Destroyer, right?
yeah, I mean, he's not yet a destroyer in the Vedas, right? He's in that sense. I mean, if you want to think of theologically, maybe some the people argue that, but I'm just talking. If you just stick to the Vedas, he's
Yeah.
not a destroyer.
But
He's
that
on the
sounds very similar to Sabazius's role
yeah
too.
yeah.
Sabazius is this dual aspect god who has this aspect of being completely warlike, completely terrifying,
Yeah.
but also brings healing and medicine and intoxication and inspiration.
So Shiva is or Rudra is not yet that. He is you appease him to keep him from destroying the sacrifice itself. He's connected to these other deities called the Maruts, and they're called the sons of Rudra. The Maruts are like basically storm gods, if you want to think about them. Like they're basically 49 of them. They're quote unquote, and they usually are the army that trails Indra also when he goes to fight Vitra or other demons. So there's like a deep connection between Rudra. Some people will say Rudra might even be connected to Odin, Deus Pitter, something like that. Although Deus Pitter in Deus Pitta in Sanskrit or the Vedas is killed by Indra, potentially maybe,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and usurped. But I mean that's just an off-throwing line, and we don't actually know.
That reminds me of Ouranous, the Sky
Yeah,
Father,
correct.
being usurped by first Saturn, but then Zeus,
Zeus.
Patar. So Ouranous means sky
Yeah.
in another is another word for sky
Sky. Yeah. Yeah.
Indo-European, but also Zeus Pater is so I can see how it's not a 1-to-1, it's like a 1.5-to-1.
Yeah.
You can see that they're doing similar things with their gods.
Although Ouranous, some Indo-European scholars try to
Varuna.
connect it to Varuna,
Varuna, yeah.
who's actually also Ahura Mazda.
Yes. The
So
sky, the father, like the king of the heavens.
yeah,
But what's funny about that, you got Mitra, Varuna, and the Vedas hyphenated. Mitra
Yeah.
and Varuna.
Yeah,
And
Mitra,
it's like
Varuna.
a dyad. And sometimes they're seen as night and day or whatever.
Well, no, Mitra is connected to many gods, so he's used as a dyad also with Agni Mitra,
Oh,
Mitra
yeah.
Varuna. So Mitra Varuna,
But you see Mitra, Varuna way more often in the
because so in the Rig Vedic context, so Indra is the war tribe. So there's two elements. There's yoga, and then there's a Shema position, which is which is basically the idea is when the tribe is in a state of peace, they're in this yoga state where they're just kind of like chilling or whatever. And then that is when Varuna has power. And then when you go to Kshema, or actually it might be the other way, Indra has power because he's a war band. So when you go out to battle, Indra is the guy you go for, but Varuna is the god of contracts. He's a sovereign of not contracts, but moral authority, because Mitra is contracts. So Mitra is lord of contracts and
Right.
relationships. Well, Varuna is considered the sovereign of all moral behavior in that sphere. He's an Aditya. He's a solar deity, so he represents light in some sense. Indra is kind of an Aditya too, but Indra is representing this martial power that goes out and conquers and creates the new lands and spreads, like the Arya movement around.
Mm.
And Varuna
Yeah.
is the one that establishes it. So,
Yeah.
and then eventually they merge kind of in Vishnu, because Vishnu in the text is also like he's an interesting character in the Veda. He's a minor, but he's also everyone doesn't know who he is. It's like he represents something else, something beyond. So where the gods look to him for their like safety at some level. Tat Vishnu Param Padam Sada Pashyati Suraha, right? That supreme location of Vishnu is where they all like are always looking towards, representing two levels: the midday sun, because again, you have to look at like the solar deities actually correspond to the 12 Adityas, kind of correspond to the movement of the sun in the horizon, like if you quarter it out like that. So the midday sun represents one, and then so you have all that. So it's very interesting to kind of delve into: are they talking about something physical here, like the world? Are they talking about liturgical? Are they talking about something purely mythological or inner self? And within the textual tradition, there's like three viewpoints called Adi Devic, Adi Bautic, and Adi Adhyatmic, which means Adi Devic is what happens out here in the world. Like so every verse represents something that can happen in the world. The second position, Adi Bautic, which is happening psychologically. So whatever we're saying in this text, you could either read it literally or you could interpret it psychologically. And the third one is Adhyatmic, which is you interpret it spiritually, internally. So
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. That's fascinating. It's
Yeah.
like I said, I wanted to reach out to you and get to start doing conversation like this because I want to learn more about the Vedic stuff. I'm completely in beginner stages when it comes to Eastern Indian stuff.
Yeah, no, and we'll do that. I think it'd be better to do that on your channel because, like, I want more of your stuff here instead of like,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
want,
We can swap it out. Yeah.
yeah, because you've had now you've been doing this for 8 years, something like that, right? Like a really long time.
I was maybe a decade total. But
Yeah.
the channel for 4 years, I think it was. Yeah, 4 years now.
Yeah. I thought it was a little long,
2001.
maybe 4 or 5 years.
I started the channel about 5 years ago, something like 4 or 5 years ago. But I've been really studying, reading, and learning for like 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so like one of the things that I really was interested, the conversation with you is learning more about this Dionysius thing, right? Like this is such an interesting, and I never thought it until I watched you and Derek, and because I haven't read that much of the textual stuff around the Greco-Roman influence on Judaism and then Christianity vis-a-vis narrative telling, which is actually kind of like how you guys are doing it, which I would love to like, can you present the argument of both the Dionysian influence on Christianity or Judaism and
It's crazy. Okay. So I already mentioned Sebaceous, how far back Sebaceous goes, being potentially somewhat cognate, even if it's not culturally, or even if the elements of Rudra aren't lining up.
Yeah.
The linguistics seems to have something going on. But Sebaceous is actually an older form of Dionysus from the Caucasus region, from over there. Where the Yamnaya people were
like the Zagros.
Yeah, way over there. Aryans over there, right? Anyways, Dionysus, you find his name in Linear B on the island of Crete, but also in southern Greece, central Greece, where the Spartans were. And you see Dewo, which is the word for Zeus or deity, God, basically.
Yeah.
It comes from that word from day, Indo-European day. So, but it's Zeus. In this case, it's Zeus or deified deity, and then Nisa or Nusa. And it's like, it looks like people are looking at this Linear B and going, oh, we found Dionysus. And even ancient authors like Pherecydes of Syros, who lived in the 6th century BCE, said that the name Dionysus isn't actually Dionysa, as in Zeus of Mount Nisa, but actually it's Zeus of the tree, which is like the vegetation, the vine, grapevine, the swelling of the fruits. And then there's actually a god called Ningishita in Babylon, whose name breaks down etymologically as Lord of the Tree.
Yeah.
So it's the same translation, different language. And if you look at Ningishita in Babylon, he's a god of intoxication, libations, the crops, swelling of crops and fruits, very similar. Also, chthonic deity. Dionysus is a chthonic deity. So there might be something going on there. And other people have pointed out Ea, which is a name for Enki, also is this god who surrounded himself with satyrs, shaggy goat-like deities, and he creates different hybrid creatures, which is what you find with Dionysus, with the satyrs. And Dionysus's name, one of the oldest names, is Ea, or Iao, or in some cases Iakos.
Okay.
Which is interesting because it sounds so similar to Yaakov, Jacob. So some people have pointed out you have Yaakos and you have Yaakov. Is there something going on here? Well, let's play this out for a second.
Sure.
So Number one, where does Yahweh come from? Well, the oldest gods, the oldest versions of El that we could find is in Ugaritic sources. So Bronze Age sources from Syria, which where you get El, you get Bel, you get Asherah, you get Mot, you get all these basically proto-Judean, proto-Israelite gods, right? These pagan Israelite gods. But there's no Yahweh there. So this is like, wait a minute, where did Yahweh come from? At some point, we know at some point Yahweh was imported. The question is from where? So right off the bat, we know he's imported. We know there's a deity in the Aegean who's called Yakos, or Yayo is another one. And that one, that name's linked to Apollo. But as some classes point out, and Nietzsche was one of them too, so does Karl Ruck and others, some people point out that Dionysus and Apollo broke off at some point. In fact, we even have evidence of this in Thrace. There's a god called Zis. His name is Zis, Z-I-S. And you think Zeus, you're like, oh, that's got to be Zeus. But then you look at this deity and what his traits are, what he does. He's like a Dionysus Apollonian crossover. He's a god of the bow. He's a god of the sun. But then he's also a god of vegetation. He's a god of grapes and fruits. So you're like, whoa, it's an Apollonian Dionysian dyad. And his name in the Ionian Islands is Yayo. So it would transliterate as I-H-I-O. Yayo. Okay. And then so then we have Yayo, you have Yao, you have Yakos. So there's something going on with this Yah character, right? Go back to Judea now. When we start to see Yahweh in the sources, he shows up. The first possible mention of Yahweh is in the inscription in Sudan, all the way down in Africa, where it mentions a tribe of people, wanderers, nomads, called the Shashu tribe. And their god is Yahweh, or Yahweh, I'd say. Okay, let's look at the Shashu people. Who are they?
When were they? Like what time period?
Bronze Age.
Okay.
late Bronze Age, before the collapse of the Bronze Age, right around the time of the collapse of the Bronze Age.
So 1200.
And I would say between 1350 to let's even say between 1500 and 1200 BC.
Okay,
somewhere in that range.
Okay.
Now, the question is, who are these Shashu people? Well, if we actually look into it, we don't know exactly where they came from. There's many theories, but all we know is that they're nomads who populate the Sinai region, also the regions of Midian, and they're possibly relatives of the Philistines.
Oh,
the Philistines are sea peoples, Aegean peoples, and this lines up with the same exact time period as when the sea people start raiding Egypt. They start raiding the coast of the Levant. They start raiding Syria. They're raiding Asia Minor, and they're making settlements there. So the Midianite cities, this is interesting because the Shashu are in Midianite cities too. They're in the Sinai, they're in Midianite, and they're in Edom, which is right below Judea. This is where Yahweh shows up. Remember, he's not an Ugaritic god. We don't know where he came from yet, but we know he shows up in this southern region where all these sea peoples are. They're right next to the Philistines, right? Now, the pottery. Oh, so another thing, when Moses encounters Yahweh for the first time in the book of Genesis, he's in Midian. He's a Midianite god. He goes to Midian. Moses leaves Egypt. He goes to Midian, and he sees the burning bush, and it's this epiphany god, which, by the way, Dionysus is an epiphany god. The god who comes. He shows up in different forms. He shows up as a lion, shows up as fire, shows up as whatever. He shows up in your head when you're drinking wine. He's an epiphany god. So Moses has an epiphany. He sees the burning bush. He's in Midian. I think there's a reason for that.
Right.
Because the Midianites are these people, these Shashu people. And if you actually look at their pottery, we dug archaeology there. We're trying to find out who these people are, right? What do you know? Guess what their pottery tells us? They're Aegean. They're from
Oh.
Greece. They are from the Greek islands. All of the Midianite pottery, mostly Aegean pottery, which means they came from the Aegean region. And it's possible that this is how Yahweh gets his way into the Levant. He lines up with this Yayo god or Yakos god. We have a linear B inscription of a god called Yahweh.
Yeah.
We have the Ionian god Yayos, and we have the Pylos god who's Yakos. And then all of a sudden, what I noticed in the Levant, when Yahweh starts becoming really popular, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, right before the Bible gets written,
right,
you start seeing Yahweh usurp Baal. Baal gets rid of Baal. El and Yahweh become this sort of dyad. But in some parts of the Levant, his name is Yo, and in other parts, his name is Yah. So you have this similar Yo and Yah that you see in the Indo and see with the Dionysian script, because the Dionysian chants in the Eleusinian mysteries, and same with Thracian mysteries, are Yo and Yah. So he has two names, Yo and Yah. In Levant, Yahweh is also, that's why you see Jacob, Yaakov, but Joseph is Yosef, but they both have a theophoric element. So you can have prophets that are named as Hosea, which is Yo, or you can have Isaiah, Isaiah. So scholars have pointed out that the northern Levant uses the word Yo for Yahweh, and the southern Levant uses the word Yah. At some point around the 8th or 7th century BCE, they drop off Yo and they just go with Yah. All right. So what do we know so far? We know that Yahweh was imported. We know that the places that he first starts off at, Midianite culture, have Aegean pottery. We know that in the Aegean, Dionysus has all these alternate names, Yayo, Yao, Yakos. And then last but not least, when we look at the early descriptions of the temple that Solomon built,
right,
Yahweh is described as this God of life. He's this God of, so they build a temple with golden grape clusters hanging down from the walls with satyrs on the columns, which are the goat men that I was mentioning earlier. So where did that come? That's very Dionysian. Also, throughout the Old Testament, Israel, or a Jacob, Yaakov, is always talked about as a vine. Jacob is a vine. If you can look this up. You can go through the Genesis. You can go through the Psalms.
That's very interesting.
They always depict Jacob as a vine, and then sometimes people are grafted in the vine or grafted out of the vine. But it's a vine culture. You go to Israel today, even to this very day, from the days of the vineyards of Jezebel, all the way till today, Judea and Israel is a viticulture, is a wine culture. There's wine. They love wine. They furnish their tables with fruits on the Sukkot festival. They during Passover they drink wine. Plutarch in the 1st century AD pointed out that he thought Yahweh was Dionysus for the exact reasons that I pointed out. But then he even goes farther. He says Dionysus, or the Eleusinian mysteries, which is central to the Yakos, they don't use the name Dionysus in Eleusinian mysteries. They use the name Yakos. They don't say Dionysus. They say Yakos. In the Eleusinian mysteries, during the fall equinox, they it's called the Thesmophoria. Get this. You know what Thesmophoria means in Greek? Lawgiver, lawbringer. Thesmophoria, bringer of the law. All right. So what they do on this day is they carry palm trees and fruits and pomegranates, and they bring them into the temple, and they celebrate. This is what they do. It's called the Sukkot festival. Same exact day of the year, fall equinox. They both have lunar solar calendars. The exact same day of the year. In Israel, they have what's called the Sukkot festival, where they carry pomegranate, and myrtle into the temples, in honor of the time where Moses brought the law to the Israelites in their tents. So they're both honoring a Thesmophoria, a law-bringing festival, at the same time of the year. So
do we have a
okay.
sense of which came first?
I think they're both drawing from a common ancestor of some sort of deity, some sort of Yah deity. It might even be Ea, the Babylonian god Ea. Because we know during the Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans were drawing heavily from Babylon. So there might have been some importation of the god Ea into the Mycenaean culture. At the same time, the Judeans are importing Ea, or at the same time, my theory is Ea goes to the Mycenaeans and then goes into the Levant via the Sea Peoples. So it's one or the other, I think. That's what I think Ea, because Yao is Iao. You're just adding an O. It's the same name. So back to, all right, so now we get to Christianity. So what I think happens is you have this backdrop, you have this Dionysian backdrop of Yahweh that's lost over time.
Sure.
By the time the 3rd century BC rolls around, there's nobody really comparing. Yeah, Dionysus is completely in a different world now. He's like this wine intoxication god, where Yahweh is more of a oracular prophecy god, which by the way lines up with the older Dionysus had this oracular prophecy aspect to him too. So you can see that lines up too.
Which happens in the play, right?
Yes.
With Pantheus.
The Bacchae, yeah. He's an oracular prophecy god. So that's what Yahweh is. So, okay, but this backdrop, this Dionysian backdrop is there in the Old Testament Yahweh. When the New Testament comes along, whoever these New Testament scholars were that wrote the Gospels, I think they were well read. They were very smart. They weren't just, there's this old idea in biblical scholarship that they were just a bunch of idiots. They're a bunch of fishermen that didn't know any better. And they just recorded what they wrote. No, this is so nonsensical for two reasons. Number one, they're connecting Old Testament motifs and applying it to Jesus in a way that nobody can do unless you were educated, unless you were reading and writing and educated. Number two, the Greek employs concepts that found in Middle Platonism and Stoicism and cynicism and the virtues and ethics that no fisherman is just randomly putting in the text by some sort of miracle, right?
Right.
So these are educated scholars, probably in Alexandria. I actually posit that these people knew, to some degree, like Plutarch. Plutarch is contemporary with the Gospels. Plutarch died.
He is. Yeah.
Plutarch died in 119 CE. The Gospels are just being finished by then. So think about it. Plutarch sees the connection between Dionysus and Yahweh. I'm saying that the scholars in Alexandria that wrote the Gospels might have saw the same thing. So what happens is the New Testament gets written. Now God takes on a fleshly form, which, by the way, Dionysus does this in the Bacchae. Dionysus comes down as a man and does his little feats with Pentheus. It's an epiphany.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ is an epiphany. He's coming to the world in fleshly form as the Son of God, right? Same thing happens in the Bacchae. And what I think happened is
this John, right? Because like Mark
John
doesn't really.
But John's more explicit about this.
Yeah.
John is the most Bacchic of all of them.
Right.
But I do think whoever wrote Mark, Matthew, and Luke are also aware of the Dionysian backdrop of all this, the sort of viticulture, the sort of Yachic backdrop of Israel. And I think they're aware of it. But you're right. John is way more explicit with it. John is actually doing straight up mimesis of the Bacchae, of Euripidean stuff. John has the logos that's there that comes from the bosom of the Father, just as Clement of Alexandria points out that Sebaceous, Dionysus, comes from the bosom of the Father. Sebaceous is actually, if you look at the Orphic hymn to Sebaceous, he's both Zeus and Dionysus.
Yeah.
Do you read the Orphic hymn? Actually, can I pull that up for you? I'll show you.
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
please.
I'll show you this right
pause
now.
it for a sec.
Okay. So this is the Orphic hymn to Sebaceous. It says fumigation of aromatics. And it says this is obviously a translation from Thomas Taylor, but it's the most accepted translation out there. Hear me, illustrious father, Damon fame, great Saturn Kronos offspring.
That's
Now, who's Saturn's offspring?
Zeus.
That's Zeus, right?
Yeah.
But check this out. And Sebaceous named, inserting Bacchus, bearer of the vine, founding God within thy thigh divine. So
He's born from the thigh.
we have this. So what is Sebaceous? He's Zeus with Dionysus in his thigh. That's what Sebaceous is.
This is from Plutarch, right?
This is from the Orphic hymns. This is even older than this is probably before before Genesis. But older than Genesis.
I mean, whoever translated used Bacchus, right? But Bacchus is a Latin word, not the Greek, right?
No, Bacchus is a Greek word.
Oh, that's another.
Yes, same with Pluto. There's two. For some reason, people think Dionysus is Greek and Bacchus is Latin, but Bacchus is actually a Greek word. It means it means like berry. Bacchus.
Okay, got it. Okay,
and it's actually cognate with Iacchos. So the older this gets a digamma. So the oldest version of Bacchus is Iacchos, and then it drops off the ya. It gets a digamma, which is wa or va, and then it ends up becoming Bacchus at some point. Okay, anyways, when we keep going, he says the mature, the Dionysian god, might burst the bands of his concealed abode and come to sacred Tmolus, his delight, where Ipa dwells, all beautiful and bright. Come, blessed Phrygian god, the king of all, and aid thy mystics. Now check this out. Where does this hymn show up in the Orphic hymns? Right next to the hymn to Dionysus, right next to the hymn of Bacchus, right next to the hymn of Dionysus again, right next to the hymn of Semele, the mother of Dionysus.
Yeah. And
right after, So you can see this is Dionysus, but in the case of Sebaceous, he's in the form of a dyad, similar to the Father and the Son, Jesus and the Father.
Right.
Sebaceous is a father-son dyad. He's Zeus and Dionysus rolled into one. And he comes in the form of a human. He comes in the form of flesh. He's a chthonic god. He's born of a mortal mother, Semele, the mortal mother, just like Jesus is. So what happens in the Gospels are doing a similar thing as the Old Testament's doing, where you have this sort of ancient Bronze Age Bacchic backdrop that's sort of dictating and influencing the themes of the Old Testament, of the vine of Israel, the vine of Jacob. And then in the New Testament, you get Jesus coming as the son of the God, the Sebaceous son, who's sort of mimicking the Dionysian, the Bacchae, all that stuff. So Dennis MacDonald wrote the book called the Dionysian Gospel. It's all about John's Gospel being completely. But he also points out Mark is very much like a tragedy,
right?
Dionysus
ends in utter tragedy.
And Dionysus is the god of tragedy. If you're going to do a tragedy, you got to go through Dionysus. So any type of tragedy is Dionysian by default. Lastly, Yaakov and Iacchos, I point out the similarities in the name. The story of Jacob and his brother Esau is so similar to the story of Pentheus and Bacchus. Because in both cases, Pentheus is the heir to Thebes. He's the prince. He's the next king in line. His father is what's his name? Oh my god.
Oh, Pantheus' father?
Yeah, what's his name again? No, not his father, his grandfather.
Is Semele's that's Semele's father.
Yeah, Semele's father.
Shit, now I forget.
Semele's father. Hold on a second. Semele. I'm just drawing a blank here. Cadmus. So
Oh,
Cadmus,
yeah.
So Cadmus, by the way, who's a Phoenician, Cadmus is a Phoenician king ruling Thebes, and his heir is Pentheus. Pentheus has the birthright.
Well, it should have been Dionysus, but I mean,
No,
that's
no,
Horus, right?
listen. Let me get there.
Yeah.
Pentheus has the birthright. Dionysus comes as a typical epiphany god, and he steals the birthright from Pentheus, just like Jacob steals the birthright from Esau.
Yeah.
They have a very similar story going on. And he's a trickster god. Guess who? Ea is the trickster god. So Jacob, think about this. Think of how crazy this is.
Is this Dennis McDonald's also his position, right?
Yeah. So Genesis talks about Jacob stealing the birthright from Esau, and
Right.
God allows it.
God allows it.
What's
Yeah.
the message there? That Yahweh is sort of a trickster god, like Ea. He likes the trickery. He promotes this kind of it's wisdom. It's divine wisdom. It's the trickster god. It's Ea. Ea is the one who saves people from the flood, right? Ea is the trickster god.
Right.
Dionysus is like this too. Dionysus comes to Thebes, where his uncle Cadmus is king. Pentheus is the heir. He's going to be the next king. What does he do? He tricks Pentheus into doing all this crazy stuff, and then Pentheus winds up getting killed, and then Dionysus becomes the heir. It's a trickster. It's the same, and his name is Yakos. So, okay, I think do you get what I'm saying? What I'm seeing?
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, the threads are being well connected, right? But I think a large part of this is we find these parallels, and then we're not necessarily sure how they connect, but we build connections, right?
Yeah,
we build these connections, and I'm not saying that's not true, because the difficulties, I mean, is in twofold. Is one, I think, well, not difficulty. I mean, let's put it this way: that region, the Levant and that Eastern Mediterranean region, was highly, highly like trafficked.
Exactly. That's what people think. The opposite.
Yeah,
we're taught, especially in the West. If you grow up Christian, you're taught that this was the holy grounds, and this was some sort of pure race that never. No. It's the opposite. It's the melting pot of the world back in the ancient world.
It is one of the biggest melting pots, because even in the Levant you find the Mitanni people, who are Indo-European, but
who worship Vedic gods.
Yes, and then
they're
you
in the
have
middle. They're in the middle of the Middle East. They're right in the Middle East, and they're worshiping Vedic gods.
Indra, Varuna, Gnosticism. They're very clearly. So that region was deeply influencing and influenced by everywhere, right? Like this is where the whole ton of trade was coming in. Like, well, there was trade coming to India. You wouldn't have as many people going back that direction because it's just so far off. Like this region was like the center of people coming from Europe, people coming from Asia, people coming from Africa. So you have all this like this commerce idea flowing through like for millennia. And to think that one tradition just was by itself was perfected and maintained its purity is very, very like
it's nonsense.
It's almost impossible. Right?
Yeah, it's nonsense. Yeah.
So in that sense, like when you put it into the context of what's going on, it makes a lot of sense that there was like this give and take, and like this God, the median hypothesis of Yahweh makes sense, right? This makes total sense of where he comes from, and then these. So like, do we see these elements in the early? I guess other question is, do we see the vine elements in, let's say, the non-Yahweh sections, when maybe God is called El or whatever? Do we see that there? Because if he doesn't, then maybe that's even more.
That's part of the reason why I haven't abandoned this theory yet, is that number one, we don't see the vine elements in Baal or El. There's a different god for that, who is more a vegetation god. Even though Baal does have some vegetation aspects, but it's not this life-giving, fruit-swelling god that you find in other aspects. But the biggest thing for me is the archaeology lines up with this. When we look at the Midianite cities, This is the biggest point that people miss. When we dig up the Midianite, we dug up 5 Midianite cities.
Yeah.
All of them had Aegean pottery as the majority of the pottery, which tells you that these people are bringing in culture from the Aegean.
Right.
And this happens to be the place where Yahweh shows up in the sources. So I just think it's not like a slam dunk, we've figured it out, case closed.
Right.
But there's enough there to say this needs to be on the table.
Right.
This needs to be considered and inspected more and analyzed more.
No,
it's very possible.
That's such a fair point. And, I think this is where it's like one of the things that strikes me is narrative formats or narrative storytelling, the way it's done, are one of the first things that many societies take on when they integrate and they build together, right? Like, because they're trying to speak to their other populations. So in that sense, is like the Homeric or the Greek, the Hellenic storytelling motifs would utterly play a big position in the retelling of, say, like the Judaic stories. You put them in a new garb because you're in a new region with new people that you want them to understand in their own terms. Because like if the text remains so ancient, like this is why, like for example, I mean I'll just say this parallel is you have the Vedas and they're kind of redone as Mahabharata and Ramayana for the masses to understand.
Yeah,
like the same ideas,
written in more of an epic, more of like a structured form, like a story.
Yeah, and so isn't that what's kind of also happening? You take these ideas that the Israelites and the Judeans have, and then you retell it in a story where
Genesis.
People are like, wow,
absolutely, that's exactly what's happening. It's the same thing, and I would even say Homer's doing that.
Yeah,
Homer's taking Mycenaean, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age myths and sewing them together into a narrative about the fall of Troy.
Yeah,
which is just probably some historical kernels of truth, just
sure.
like Genesis has probably some historical kernels of truth going on there. I'm sure the Mahabharata has some historical kernels of truth somewhere within it. So what they're doing is they're taking history, they're taking mythology, and they're weaving it together for a national epic.
Yeah,
it's kind of brilliant.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant, and it's funny because it's like within, but the flip side is, for Christians and Jews, I mean, not all Jews, but some Jews, the historicity is so important to them.
Yeah,
like it's so important that Jesus was walking this earth, was born again. Rose from the dead, did these things, because if he didn't, then the faith doesn't matter. And I've had this argument,
I think that's a shame. I don't think Christianity started off that way.
I don't think so either.
I think that's like 3rd, 4th century Christianity sort of becoming more doctrinal. That's what I think happened.
Yeah, and so like within even the Hindu tradition, like even if Krishna doesn't exist, Rama doesn't exist, the truth does of the text. And so like the text itself, even the text itself refers to itself being reborn in each telling and becoming alive in the mind of people, right? It's not just simply that this happened in a faraway time, because who the hell knows how it happened, when it happened, and if it really happened. The reality is when the story happens, as you read it, as you partake in it, you're living that story. And that's true.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I think Christianity today misses, is that living element.
Yeah. I think it went from having elements of symbols and mystical, mystical doctrines that people can take from to this sort of, you have to align yourself with these ideas or else, which I think this is why I agree with Friedrich Nietzsche with the God is dead thing. Yeah. Once you do that, once you make it about, once you tell the person that they have to choose this or else, you've killed all the spirituality from these stories, from the process of religion is no more. It's not religion anymore. It's just the ideology. It's something you have to align yourself with this, or else you're going to burn in hell. That's so backwards compared to how the ancients did religion. The
Right.
ancients did religion for people as a process to unite people, for guidelines in life, for structure, for symbols and for inspiration and wisdom. All of a sudden,
Right.
you're telling people, oh, if you don't believe that this thing happened in 30 BC, you don't
Yeah.
believe, or 30 AD, if you don't think that happened, then something's wrong with you and God hates you. Like,
Right.
where's the virtue in that?
Right.
You lost all the virtue. Where's the knowing the self? How do you know yourself? By just accepting a dogma? You can't. So that's why I think
You're preaching.
whatever happened in 4th century Christianity did a lot of damage to not just the world, not just Christianity, but to the world.
So
Because
let me ask you
other-
this.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, as a follow-up is like, have you found yourself aligning more with the historicity or the mythicism idea or Christ, or do you think it doesn't matter?
It's funny you asked that because I do think there was a guy. I think there was a Jesus of Nazareth, probably.
Yeah.
However, I agree with the mythicists that the written stories that are in the Gospels that we have right now are more than 95% either drawing from Old Testament motifs or drawing from other cultural milieu sources. So at the end of the day, they're applying all this stuff to Jesus, and they're making him into the Superman character. And it's no longer they do this with other characters too.
Yeah.
They do this with Caesar Augustus. They do this with Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
They did this with Apollonius of Tyana. So people can be historical, but their stories can be completely mythological with a little bit of history as the basis of it. So I agree with the mythicists that the Gospels are myths, but I don't agree that the Jesus of Nazareth was completely made up from thin air. That's how I answer that.
No, that's interesting. Because that has been a very I would tend to agree with you. I think there was a guy named Jesus that walked the earth that was killed by the Romans and then was crucified and I think he was put in a grave and that was it. But
That was it.
But I mean that's kind of how Mark ends it, right? And then you have the embellishments that go on in each other ones. And it's funny to see.
And that tells you something right there. If Mark's the first gospel, most people agree that Mark's the oldest.
Yeah.
And Mark ends his story with the women being told that he rose and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That tells you something about early Christianity. They didn't care about the resurrection as much.
Right. And what does it mean to be he rose? Did he just go to heaven? Did he we
don't know.
Yeah. So
but it's no different. It's no different than Romulus.
Yeah.
When people are told that Romulus
saw him.
He gets exalted to the right hand of Jupiter, it says.
Yeah.
Which is, if they're like, oh, that's not a resurrection because it wasn't physical. Well, Mark's resurrection isn't physical either. You don't see him. So it's no different than Romulus or Hercules. It's a standard exaltation. It's not even a physical resurrection.
Yeah, and then so on that point, you have this resurrection motif playing out. Do you, in this context, right? So you've studied this quite often. Like, where do you see that? We have, like we talked about earlier in the beginning of the episode, that a lot of the scholars in Christianity and Judaism are Christians or Jews themselves that have some engagement, right? Like Wes Huff has been going off for months now talking about how literally you can accept the Bible and how like perfect these sources are. How does he not respond to this with your arguments in any like sense of taking it seriously? Because I mean, he's a scholar.
He has nothing to gain from admitting he's wrong about the things that he's supposed to be studying. He's embarrassed. That's what I think. He's embarrassed that I caught him on something pretty bad. Because this is supposed to be his field. It's not like he's a scholar of, I don't know, archaeology of Nazareth or something. He's a scholar of textual criticism of the Gospels. This is his area.
Right.
And he's completely butchering his own area, and he's about to get his PhD like next month. So it's like, what the hell? What have you been doing for the last 8 years?
Right. And this is where it's like I struggle because now you have, I mean, not just him, but there's other people with these PhDs that, you know, I hear them talk and I'm like, you're kind of being disingenuous.
Yeah,
Like the fact these texts are not magically different from any other text in that time period.
yeah,
And like these aren't eyewitness accounts. Like
no,
it's just why do you
yeah,
keep
and that's
saying
another
this?
thing. They'll say Paul. They'll say there's 500. We have as if us scholars
Right.
have 500 different sources back here that all talk about Jesus' resurrection.
Right.
No, you have one guy, Paul, who wasn't even there. So he's not a primary source. He's a secondary source
20
that
years later.
says 20 years later that says 500 people saw Jesus. He doesn't name any of them.
No.
So we don't have 500 eyewitnesses. We have 0 eyewitnesses. We have one letter, secondary, who claims 500 people saw him. That's way different than how someone like Wes reports this to Joe
Right.
Rogan. Wes tells Joe Rogan very sneakily, he'll say, Joe, we have 500. Actually, he said 300 for some reason.
He said 400. He said
Yeah, he
400.
said, for
yeah.
whatever. Let's let him pass. It was maybe he slipped.
Yeah.
Joe, we have 400 eyewitnesses that saw him. If I was Joe, I think Joe did ask him something like, "Oh, do we know? Did they write anything down?"
Yeah, he
And
did. He did.
yeah, and then he slips out of it. He goes, yeah, he sort of slips out of it. But I just remember watching this and going, "This is not honest. This is not honest scholarship."
Sure.
I don't care if you believe it or not. That's beside the point. You can believe it all you want. Just be honest about the data.
Right. I will say this at minimum for this. Like, when it comes to Islamic scholarship, at least they have the isnad at some level that you can be like, they have that chain of narration that gives
Yeah.
some level of validity to, okay, maybe, because I mean, at some point you're trusting something versus nothing, right? Like,
Right.
in the Pauline context, you're like, who told you this? Like, where is your source? Where is your like? Did John the Third tell you, and he was there personally? Like, we have no. The one thing they cling on is, and Paul says, and some of these people are still alive today. And you're just like, well, I mean, I don't know what that means. Again, it's just like a random claim, and again, hyperbole. No one takes any of this as hyperbole. When you tell a story, it's like, yeah, man, I dunked at the dude. Thousands of people saw me. You're like, maybe like 30 people saw me. But that's the thing. It's like they assume these gospel writers are writing with fidelity to every minutia, and there's no hyperbole going on. There's no
Right. There's
myth
no
making.
yeah, there's nothing like that. No applying motifs from the old. Like they just think it's all like someone was walking around with a pencil and a paper, just writing down history. Like this is a history.
Yeah.
Like we have annals, we have Tacitus's annals,
Yeah.
and when you read an annals, it's not fun. It's not like a cool
It's
story.
boring as
It's
fuck.
like in the 15th year of Tiberius, Senator this did this.
Yes.
The next year they did this. The next year they did this. There's nothing. There's no Jesus gathered up the disciples and they went
No.
up to a mountain. There's nothing like. There's no narratives like that. That's not what a history text looks like. Now, don't get me wrong. Herodotus, Thucydides, some of these historians are great.
Megasthenes.
Yeah, they make really good narratives out of history.
Right.
Well, you can tell when it's a historian drawing up narratives versus when it's more legendary. So the Greek Alexander romance is not a
Yeah.
history book.
No.
It's a legend. The life of Augustus from Suetonius is not a history book. It's a legend. You
Yeah.
can tell. There's ways we can tell.
And even with Herodotus, you can tell like parts where like he says, "Yes,
Legendary.
I hear, I hear they're ants the size, ants the size of horses in Persia." And
Right.
you're like, okay, yeah. I mean, you've
Even
heard,
even the historians are legendizing
Yeah.
things.
yeah, which is fair. I mean, in the ancient world, that happens pretty often because you're not able to get to that location or see it, whatever, and the world is still magical in some sense. And here in this day and age, it's not. You can't hold the gospel and say it's like today's certainty.
Right.
It's just not. Like
Yeah.
ancient texts are not like that. and their purposes are different than history, unless you talk about the annals or something like that, right?
Yeah.
They're not trying to give you the exact what occurred. They're trying to give you a message, an idea that
There
you
is
can like,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So like, what else are you working on right now that's like it's like really uh uh catching your attention?
So I have some documentaries that I'm working on. I'm writing in scripts for, but I also have a couple interviews coming out. So yeah, there's going to be some content coming out pretty soon.
Yeah,
I have
no,
a I'm writing a script about um like one of my scripts that I'm writing about is the Dark Ages topic because I had that in my mind. But I also have another script that I'm writing about early cultic activity in around Mediterranean, like a lot of
yeah,
like doing a lot of comparison between early cultic activity, what it was like at the Iron Age and the Classical period. A lot because I think that people have this backwards idea of what paganism is, as if it's one big religion called
yeah,
paganism. And I want to show people, look, this cult over here in modern day Spain
yeah.
was doing this. They believe this in comparison to this one over here that did this. And these are both pagans, but look how different they are. I
Oh yeah,
want
I
people
get
to
called a
realize,
pagan, man. I
yeah,
get called a
exactly.
pagan.
I want people to realize that that term pagan doesn't make a lot of sense.
No,
It just means non-Christian or
yeah,
non-Jew. That's
it's
all it
just like
means.
Gentile versus
It just means not Abrahamic religion. That's all it means.
right,
And
right.
it actually doesn't make any sense if you actually think about it. So
Yeah, and then so we've discussed some of the Dionysian stuff. What are your thoughts on the Gnostics? Like the Gnostics of, the Valentinians, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel
yeah.
of Judas. I mean, like, what are your thoughts on
So
Gnosticism?
it's a good question because the narrative that we're told by the traditions of the church is that their tradition goes all the way back to Jesus,
Yeah,
untouched. And then Gnostics came along at some point and tried to mess with everything, and they
yeah,
got rejected. But that, if you actually look at the history and the data, it's actually the opposite. It's actually as early as possible, you find Gnosticism in the sources. So you and the Gnostics themselves, who are Basilidians, the Simonians, the Valentinians, the Carpocratians, the Nacenes, the Sethians, and there's a whole bunch of them. The Marcosians, I could go on and on. Marcionites.
yeah,
Anyways, those people are followers of Paul for the most part. They have gospels like Gospel of Luke or Gospel of John central to them. They're not coming out the woodwork and changing what's going on. There are early Christians following the early Christianity, following the Gospels, following Paul's letters. They are Christians. They're not
mhm,
even, most of them don't even call themselves Gnostics. There are a few that do. The Carpocratians, we have a source that says they style themselves as Gnostics. So we have one person saying that they call themselves Gnostics, but we don't know if they actually did.
yeah,
So there might be some truth to the fact that there might be some people calling themselves Gnostics. All right, most of them don't though. Most of them follow the Gospels, the traditional Gospels. Most of them follow Paul's epistles. Marcion, for example. Marcion's father was Philologus. Philologus is one of the 70 disciples from Luke Acts.
right,
So I'm painting the picture here is these are not invaders of Christianity that came out of nowhere. These are people who were there in the beginning who got kicked out later, late second century. So up until the 150 AD, right before the time of Justin Martyr, the so-called Gnostics were just part of the church. If you read Celsus, Celsus names all the sects, the Sethians, the Carpocratians, the Marcionites, the Valentinians, and he says they're part of the great church.
right.
He doesn't say they're Gnostics and they're heretics. They're part of the great church. And so then all of a sudden in the and then you have Valentinus in the 130s, who's running for Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and he second in votes. He almost became the Pope.
Yeah,
He's a
yeah,
Gnostic.
I remember.
He's a Gnostic heretic. Then after that decade, the 140s and 150s, then you start to get the debates between Justin Martyr and the Marcionites or the Valentinians,
Right.
and they're all sort of duking it out, which leads to the latter half of the 2nd century, when you start getting Hippolytus and Irenaeus, who write their treatises against heresies.
Yeah.
So it's the late 2nd century where these so-called Gnostics get claimed heretics. But the first half of the 2nd century, and even the second half of the 1st century,
right,
you have what these so-called Gnostics are just Christians. They're just part of the. So do they have their own gospels? Yeah, they bring in the Sethians, bring in their own text.
Yeah,
they bring in their own text. Don't get me wrong, but early on, they're just part of the Christian culture. It's no different than, I don't know if you've ever heard of these New Testament apocryphal books.
Of course,
Tony Burke. These are just added texts that
Book of Enoch, all that stuff is.
Yeah, you get all these apocryphal books. Like for example, I'm just going to pull up a random one: the Book of Bartholomew.
Yeah,
the homily on the Passion of the Resurrection, the Acts of Thomas, the
that's
Acts
the one
of
where he
Peter.
goes to India, apparently.
Yeah, the Acts of Nereus. Now, these aren't considered Gnostic, but they're not canonical.
No.
So when one of them gets called Gnostic and bad, the other ones just get called apocryphal. It's like we're just making up terms at this point. So
what does apocryphal mean to them?
Right, it means like non-canonical, some semi-accepted. Like they're the so-called Orthodox Christians are reading these texts. They're probably in the churches too, but they're not considered canonical.
They're just not have as much power as
Whereas down in Egypt, down in Nag Hammadi, you find this whole entire plethora of literature that was accepted to them at some point and then later rejected, just like the apocryphal text. But for some reason, these ones are considered Gnostic. These ones aren't. I say they're all just Christian texts. And at some point, some of them drop off, some of them stay together. That's just how it is. But all culture is.
But it's so funny because, like, coming from a Hindu dharmic background, like, we have similar issues without a doubt. Like, you have multiple texts, and we have hundreds of Puranas and ancillary texts that all these. So the question is, like, what each community considers canonical to them.
Right.
But the thing we don't say is that text is terrible. What we say is, actually, no, that text is fine as long as it doesn't contradict ours. If it contradicts ours on this tradition, then we either reinterpret that text to fit it, or we just don't hear. We don't read that one passage, that verse. And there's no sense of this entire group of people, these belief system, you're heretics. It's a weird like concept that I think like in Christianity has really changed its openness to new ideas.
That's the difference between the so-called the idea that the Gnostics came along and tried to change what was already in place. It's the opposite. It's 4th century Romans. The government decided, Constantine, Eusebius, those guys, Epiphanius.
I mean, Constantine didn't care what went, but
he convenes these bishops and goes, no more are we going to have an open dialogue of what texts are. No, we need to have an established dogma. We need to have an established doctrine. We got to decide on what we believe about God's nature. You got to decide all these things. Now, by that time, the sort of books of the Bible were already sort of, there already was a sort of established canon at that point. There already was sort of an elite group of Christians that were considered themselves Orthodox or Catholic.
Right.
But Constantine's sort of tying up all the loose ends and saying, we guys need to figure out what we believe about God and what we don't. And we're going to make everything else heretical. And we're going to make this the standard.
Right.
But they had to come along and make that choice. Whereas in the 2nd century and the 1st century, Christianity was more open, was more of like a find a relationship with Christ.
Right.
However you have to do it. Whereas 4th century Christianity, here's how you get to Christ. We decided how to do it.
Right, right.
So it's not like they had these doctrines settled by Jesus's time and Paul's time, and then they had to get all the way to Constantine and hold on for dear life from the heretics. No. They were the heretics and the Orthodoxy were all part of the same cult, same
Right.
culture. And at some point, it was the elitist Christians who made the choices. They weren't holding on to something that was already there. They changed it up. So does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. They changed it based on their belief system as opposed to like anything more.
Or even more than that, based on what would work better for an empire.
That's true. That's fair.
You
That's
know?
a fair point. Like, and that's the frustration again, bringing Wes Huff up again is just like when he says, oh, there's these Gnostic gospels, but they're not.
He says they're late. They're late. They're 3rd and 4th century.
Yeah. And they're not part of the canon because they have their own agenda. I'm like, what?
Right. But what's so funny about that is he ignores what I just said.
Right.
He ignores that the Simonians existed in the 1st century. The Carpocratians existed in the late 1st, early 2nd century.
Right.
He ignores all, like, he's only focusing on 3rd and 4th century Gnostic texts.
Right.
Because he's trying to make you seem like these came later. They don't matter. But he never addresses what were the Simonians and the Carpocratians and the Valentinians doing in Rome in the early 2nd century. Why don't we?
Right.
He never addresses that.
You know what's funny? Have you ever tried to read Paul's books without thinking about the Gospels, the 4 Gospels?
Yeah. Oh yeah. All the time.
It's very interesting when you try to read it that way.
You get a different Christianity.
You get a very different Christianity.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you think about the 4 Gospels weren't yet written by the time Paul was doing his thing.
Yeah.
He was already he was on his path. So what was his Christianity basis? It wasn't the Gospels. What do you think his basis
it was a more personal, like you can tell Paul is sort of following what I would call the cult of Theos Hypsistos, which is a religion that existed from the 1st century, 2nd century BC, all the way through the 5th century AD, where it was basically just an idea. It was like almost like ancient deism in a way, because there's this idea that there's one God called God Most High, Theos Hypsistos, and it's very Platonic.
Yeah.
Where this is one God, and they don't show images of him in their temples. Paul was a Jew, but I think he was extending an olive branch to these Greeks who believed in Theos Hypsistos, Hypsisterians.
Yeah.
But he also believed in the Messiah. He also believed Jesus was the Messiah, maybe because he had a vision or whatever. So I think what Paul is doing is he's very much interested in these Greeks that are following one God. And he's also teaching them, by the way, this one God sent a Messiah, and he came, he died, and here's what happened. So he's trying to tie up these different cultures of Theos Hypsistos and Pharisaic Judaism.
Yeah.
So it's not even Christianity yet. It's just like in limbo in between Judaism and Theos Hypsistos religion.
That's very fascinating, right? I mean, that's which actually makes so much more sense when you think about it. He was a Roman citizen.
Yeah, because think about who's Paul writing to.
Yeah.
There's no Gospels out. There's no, but who are these churches? There's no Gospels. There's nothing before Paul's letters. So how do they get together and decide, we're going to start a church based on what? And you don't even know who Jesus is yet. Paul hasn't even written to you yet. The Gospels aren't out yet. So there had to have been some sort of cultic network, which I think it's these pagan monotheists called the Hypsisterians. And I think these Hypsisterians were already in contact with Pharisaic Jews from around the empire, not just in Jerusalem, but around different cities, because there's a lot of Jewish populations in these big cities, urban cities. Right. Pergamum had a Jewish population. Alexandria had a Jewish population. Antioch, Syria, Rome, all these major urban hubs had Jewish populations, but they also had Platonic / Pythagorean or / Orphic Greeks,
right,
who thought that there was one God that was the most powerful god who created everything. And they thought of Aphrodite and Dionysus and as like lesser daemons.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Paul, I think Paul is writing to these people.
I think that's a fair point, because like even when you consider like the time of the Maccabees, right, with the whole Maccabean revolution is around the Hellenization of the Jews that started taking these ideas and doing
they're
the same
writing
thing.
And in Maccabees, if you read Maccabees, they're writing to the Spartans.
Correct.
And the Spartans are saying, we're all together, we're all sons of Abraham.
Yeah.
That's second century BC,
Right.
before Christianity. Christianity didn't bring Judaism to the Roman world.
It was already there.
There's a book called One God.
Oh yeah, I
see
see
it?
that. Okay. Yeah.
It's called Pagan Monotheism in the Roman Empire. Stephen Mitchell and Peter. It's peer reviewed from Cambridge, and the professor who wrote this, professor of Hellenistic culture at University at Exeter.
Okay.
And
I'll check that out.
The other author is Peter Van Nuffelen, research professor of ancient history at University of Ghent. It's a very academic book. But what it does is it shows you how much monotheism there was in pagan Greece and pagan Rome. This was already an idea that was already kind of flourishing, and Paul already had an audience to reach out to. That's what I try to get people to realize, that Paul didn't just bring these wild pagan orgy loving goat sacrificing people the message of Christ. The people were already looking for this sort of culture already.
Right. And I think it's also interesting on this point, like monotheism and polytheism have always been there, present for most of human history, and they're always jousting for supremacy. And I think Christianity, in some sense, did do a great job of merging it within the triune God, because it is kind of polytheistic, but still preserves
triads were big in Platonism. Big in Platonism, and big even in the ancient cults. You would go to a temple, and there were a lot of times you would find a triad of three gods in the temple.
You know why that is?
Why is that?
Indo-European.
Masculine,
feminine, neuter. That's masculine,
right.
feminine, neuter.
Because you find Georges Dumazil's book on Indo-European religion talks about triads all the way back in ancient Indo-European culture being a popular thing. And he said exactly what we're saying right now. And
then they also have one, two, many. Right. That's the
right.
It's like the singular.
It goes the monad, the dyad, and then plural.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? How the languages now like impact the way you think about like. I don't know about Hebrew if it has masculine, feminine, neuter, but maybe it does, and then that reflects there too. But it's clear the Greek does, and maybe that influences the way the Trinity comes about. I don't know. I mean, it's just
I think there's some truth to that. I think they're definitely being inspired by the triadic cults. Like Egypt has their triad of Osiris, Isis, and Harpocrates or Horus. You have, or even the dyad concept of Sebaceous. Because the Christian Trinity doesn't have a goddess there. No. And I know Mary gets a lot of veneration. But if you actually look if you look at the Trinity, though, the Trinity is very particular. It's the Father and the Son, and then a mediating Holy Spirit in between them. It's actually a dyad. Well, the Gnostics call it Sophia. Yeah. But the Orthodox Trinity is very specific about it's the Father and the Son. It's two. It's a dyad. And there's a mediating spirit between it, which is like the Sabazian dyad. The Sabazian dyad is Zeus, Dionysus, and that Bacchic inspiration in between them.
Interesting. Yeah.
So sometimes a dyad can look like a trinity, but it's also just a dyad. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But it's also very interesting. I feel like across many traditions, wisdom is always feminine.
Always.
Right? Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Because when I'm looking at Genesis or Proverbs 8 talks about Chokmah, which is wisdom. It's a feminine word, and the Septuagint has Sophia in there,
right?
And it makes me think that they're borrowing from the Greeks, but then it's hard to make that argument because it's not just the Greeks that are feminizing Sophia, But even in all the way in the East, they're doing a feminine version of Sophia, right? Or wisdom, right? Is that what they're?
Yeah, because even one of the in Zoroastrianism, one of the Amisha Sapentas is good wisdom, and that's
Yeah.
feminized, as along with the Yezitas, the which are the gods that they worship, or the divinities, which is Anahata, who's also the goddess of wisdom.
Anahita, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so
and she's connected to Saraswati in the or Vak in the Hindu tradition or the Vedic tradition.
but I also, and so I made this case that, a lot of the Tanakh is borrowing from Greek thought, because Sophia is one of these aspects that you see in Proverbs 8.
Yeah,
But it's not just the Greeks. It's probably just an Indo-European tradition.
Exactly.
Because the Babylonians don't have a female wisdom character. It's vacant. They have Nabu, who's a wisdom god of writing. Then they have Ea or Enki, who's the god of wisdom. So the Old Testament is drawing from either the Greeks or the broader Zoroastrian / Greeks or something like that.
Or Sophia is also Athena, Minerva. All these are goddesses of wisdom, right? Like,
right.
It's very interesting how like, and many of the goddesses are, I mean, they're rivers too, somehow connected to, but I don't know in the Greek context if Athena is connected to a river, because the Greeks are very also, they know that they came there from outside. They knew that from their oldest texts. They're actually not native to the land. They came from outside.
And they call the natives the Pelasgians.
Yeah.
But they talk about the Pelasgians being sort of interrupted by travelers from, the Asia Minor region or the Black Sea region. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Vedics don't know they come from outside. They just believe they've been there.
Right.
It's very interesting. I mean, there's a lot more like complexity around the Vedic stuff, because the race element becomes really big, and that has been big for years, about the nature of, these white Aryans came into these black Indians, and and then the words used like Krishna Tvaj, which means like black skin, really doesn't mean black skin. It means like, like when you say, he's dark. He's got, it just means like he's got a darkness about it. He's not good. He's whatever. So it's there's complexity in like in like trying to decode and understand that part of the world.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I know I've taken up so much of your time, Neal. Like, I appreciate everything you've, the great conversation. I don't want to take more of your time, but like, I would love to have you back on. And
we'll do more of these for sure.
Yeah. So do you, I'm gonna put your show notes on the show notes. I'll put your YouTube and all that stuff. What else do you want to tell my audience about like the work you do, and then what to look for and where to look for you?
I'm on Twitter. Look up Gnostic Informant on Twitter, or at Gnosis Informant is my tag, and YouTube / just like look up Gnostic Informant. I'll come right up and check me out there. That's it.
All right, guys. Thank you guys all for joining us, and we will touch back with you later. So take care, everyone, and have a great day.
पावन मुनि जन यमुना तीरे पावन मुनि जन यमुना तीरे गायति वनमाली गायति वनमाली गायति वनमाली